Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the Tangle podcast, the place we get views from across the political spectrum on the big debates of the day, some independent thinking, and then a little bit of my take. Today, we are sitting down with Philip Wallach. Philip is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also known as AEI, where he studies America's separation of powers with a focus on regulatory policy issues and the relationship between Congress and the administrative state. He is also the author of the forthcoming book, Why Congress, where he explains why our increasingly divided politics demand a legislature capable of pitting factions against each other and forcing them to work out some accommodations. He is also someone whose writing has been featured in the Tangle newsletter, and he's one of the first back-to-back Tangle podcast interviewees I've ever had, because last week we recorded a whole podcast without me pressing record. So thank you, Philip, for coming back on the show and all your grace in accepting my huge technological error. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure.
So listen, this has been a obviously eventful week. I want to talk a little bit about the debt ceiling. We're recording this on Friday, June 2nd. As of last night, it sounds like the Senate has passed a debt ceiling deal that was first passed in the House. And I'm very interested to get some of your thoughts on that. But I want to start with a little bit of a crash course on your book, maybe. And, you know, I guess just how you think we've reached a broken Congress and, you know, where you see the origin points of this current Congress that we're all operating in and observing.
Sure. So I think the first thing to say is Congress is an institution that can be a lot of different things, that can organize itself in very different ways. And at different eras in American history, we have seen a lot of different styles of Congress. And so right now we're pretty deep into an era that encompasses pretty much the whole 21st century of very, very strong leadership dominance of both chambers. It's especially unusual for the Senate. But where we have very strong speakers of the House, very strong Senate majority leaders, we more or less think of them as having complete control over the agenda of each of their chambers. And we think of the two parties as being very well disciplined in following their leaders in both chambers. It's forgivable for anybody who feels like things have just always been that way, because they have been that way for a while now, but you need to extend your timeline a little farther back and realize that in fact, this is rather unusual in the big scope of congressional history. So we've often had a much more decentralized institution where there are many power centers, often in the congressional committees, the chairman being the big power brokers of a previous era, for example, the 1950s and 60s. And we've seen eras of strong leaders in the distant past where members have eventually decided that they would overthrow the strong leadership and reorganize the chambers to be more amenable to free-flowing action driven by the rank-and-file membership. So that's a live possibility, and part of the point of the book is to try to sort of just expand people's imaginations when it comes to the possibilities for Congress, help them realize that if they're dissatisfied with the way things are today, then just drawing on the institution's own experience, there are other possibilities.
Yeah, I'm definitely somebody, I would say, who worries a great deal about the centralized power in House leadership and Senate leadership. And I've written a little bit about this in the newsletter every now and then when you see the dysfunction really break through. I'm curious if maybe you could explain a little bit about why this is a big deal. I mean, why does it matter that, you know, Nancy Pelosi's sitting down with Chuck Schumer and a few other major House players, and they're coming up with legislation that they're going to try and push through and pass? I mean, what's different about that than what happened in the past? And why do you feel like it's not a good way for Congress to function?
So I think we have to think about Congress's place in the American constitutional system. And really, Congress, after the design of James Madison, is really the place where we're supposed to have all our different factions from our extended republic, right? If you go back to your civics class and remember Federalist number 10, You're supposed to have all these different factions come in and check each other, bounce up against each other. And by virtue of there being a lot of them, we ensure that no one of them ever dominates and becomes tyrannical. And we still need that dynamic in our politics today. And what we have, when we reduce the complexity all into just two parties with very strong leaders sort of relentlessly pursuing combat with each other, we really kind of abstract all of that complexity of the American people out of our politics, and it becomes something very impoverished instead. I really think it leads to a sense of alienation from the work of our government, a sense that, you know, the other guys are screwing it up. If that's sort of, you're always thinking about how to beat the other team at the next election, and that's pretty much your only priority, then that's going to be the message you're communicating to your voters all the time. So we're really missing out on sort of Congress as the engine of compromise. And we really can't get that from anywhere else. If the executive branch is dominated by the president is one person who is de facto the leader of a political party. The president is not capable of reconciling all these different interests all in his own bosom somehow, right? It just doesn't work well. And the judiciary is even worse because it's by design a reactive body that has to take the cases that come before it. It's not built to be a representative institution at all. And so we really need Congress. That's the main message of the book is don't give up on Congress. We really need it to work. But when we have it just become this leader-dominated place, it doesn't deliver on all of its potential.
One thing that I loathe about a lot of political punditry and a lot of writing that I think is typical of, you know, exploring some of the issues that you're talking about is there are very rarely solutions presented or answers presented. And I know that you have some ideas about how we might actually be able to get out of this dynamic. So I'm curious if maybe you could talk a little bit about how you think we can reshuffle or restructure the way Congress works right now that might make it more like what you imagine a functioning Congress to be.
Yeah. So first of all, let me say that I kind of take it as a given that it has to be driven by the members at some level. I really don't expect there to be a grassroots movement across America for congressional reorganization. Like, much as these issues fascinate me and preoccupy my attention, I understand this stuff sounds sort of obscure and boring to most people. So it's got to be the members themselves that drive it. And so we have to ask, why have they allowed things to be set up the way they are? And it's because I think they really do sincerely believe in the importance of winning the next election. And we live in this knife-edge era where it always seems like the control of Congress might be swinging in the next election. That's an accurate perception, and it really colors how members think of the moment. We've had other eras where one party is just the dominant party and expected to retain the majority. That changes the incentives for members. So we live in a time when members are worried about the next election, and the question is just like, are they willing to subordinate everything else to it? And the sources of hope in my book are really that the members themselves are just show up to work and say, man, if my job consists of dialing for dollars and then showing up and voting the way the boss tells me, then my job is really not so great. And for the kind of ambitious people who go and get elected to Congress, you'd hope that they really chafe under the constraints of the way the current Congress works, and they want to bust it open. And I think an awful lot of them are very sincere in wanting to do good for the American people. So there's a sense of frustration that so much of what they would like to do is just kept off the agenda, not even sort of tackled. It's not even that we're trying and failing. It's that the leadership keeps these things from ever getting voted on at all. So I think member frustration is my source of hope, and the hope is that they'll say, we just can't allow the leader to call all the shots. We need to bust things open and have a more free-flowing interaction between all these groups.
I imagine when writing this book, you probably got a chance to talk to some members or at least go listen to certain members talk about issues that related to this. I'm curious if maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you heard from them. I mean, I'm very curious to hear how members of Congress actually feel about this dynamic, or what they say when they feel like they're speaking to somebody who's like-minded about wanting some of these changes. Because from my perspective, I think one of the things that is frustrating is, and this applies on both sides of the aisle, is that it does just feel like most of the time, most members are just kind of falling in line and following the party's lead. And I feel like I'm seeing, less and less pushback to this dynamic as the days go on. So I'm curious what you encounter, speaking to members of Congress when you talk about this issue.
Yeah, I think most members are genuinely ambivalent on these issues. I think, they tend to be committed partisans. They're sincere in their belief that it's important for their party to win. And so, to some extent, they believe that getting lined up behind the messaging that their leaders broadcast out to them really is important. And I think at the same time, they kind of understood, especially in the Pelosi era. I feel like Democrats understood, like, she had carrots and she had sticks, and she wasn't afraid to use them, and they did not want to be on her bad side. So I think members have a lot of frustrations, but they're pretty good at tamping them down most of the time. The kind of members who are most eager to talk to me are the kind of people who are most likely to get themselves in trouble. One of the blurbers from my book is a former Congressman, Dan Lipinski, who's from the Chicago area and lost a primary a few years back because he was really one of the last pro-life Democrats in Congress and clashed with the leadership on all sorts of things. But he has a sense from talking to his former colleagues that really, there are really very widespread frustrations. People feel like their jobs have been narrowed down so badly. People are frustrated about the way that committee work doesn't always go anywhere anymore. You labor on a committee, you try to make yourself a real policy expert so you can write good laws, but then in the end, like, legislation just gets worked out in the speaker's office anyway, and sort of your work product gets neglected. There's a lot of frustration with that. So, I think there's a lot of members who want to sort of get down to the hard work and are frustrated to the extent to which their current jobs just don't let them do that.
Yeah, I'm interested to pivot a little bit to some of the current events going on, just how you feel like this dynamic has impacted the debt ceiling. To me, it seems like there are some very obvious intersections here between what we just witnessed in Congress with the debt ceiling fight and just even the framing from the media that this is, Biden and the White House and McCarthy and Republican leadership sort of facing off and trying to flesh out what's going to happen. And then it's like, we have 5 days until we default on the debt, and everybody can either get on board or destroy the economy, basically. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you view this whole framing and also what you think about the latest deal. I mean, most people listening to this probably listen to our podcast regularly and the newsletter, so they have a pretty good idea of the outline of the deal as we covered it last week.
Let me say, first of all, I've been studying the debt limit for about a decade now. And so some of my thoughts on it are a little bit separate from my book. But I will say the dynamics of these debt limit negotiations are always going to rely on centralized leadership. Like, that just seems fairly inevitable. The way you have your backs against the wall and you have to cut a deal, that just pushes us very strongly in the direction of let's get the partisan leaders together in a room and make a deal, and all the members will just have to live with it. And it'll be up to the leaders to sell it to their members. I think that dynamic is kind of inevitable for this particular policy. So I wouldn't be as worried as much about the centralization there. I think concerning the deal, it was kind of amazing how once Biden and McCarthy's people actually sort of got together in earnest and started bargaining in good faith, it really just wasn't that hard. like there were some angry moments and storming out and finger pointing, and you wonder how much of that end up just being for show. But it really just wasn't that hard to make a deal that ultimately got 314 votes in the House of Representatives. There was a big bipartisan majority waiting to be had there. And it's a reasonable deal. And I guess these are puff pieces. You have to take them with a grain of salt. If you read about the reporting on the negotiations, they're like very heartening. Like, these people did not hate each other. They acted like professionals. They respected each other. They believed that they were operating in good faith, and they made a deal. It's not like it's impossible, even in the current political moment. You know, what we can say is extraordinary about what happened is that 29 Republicans voted against the rule for this bill in the House of Representatives. So let me just explain. Even Tangle readers may not all be up on the Rules Committee's role in the House. So most important legislation in the House comes to the floor under the auspices of a special rule, which is passed by the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is unusual in being stacked in favor of the majority. It has 9 members for the majority party and 4 members for the minority party. And in recent years, it has been thought of as a creature of the speaker, almost entirely, such that you get strong partisan dynamics, right? You sort of slam things through, and all of the members are sort of expected to vote on party lines on every rule. It's sort of a kind of just standard exercise. When you brought this rule up in the Rules Committee, two of the members who had fought against McCarthy in the speakership fight in January and got themselves appointed to this committee, that's Chip Roy and Ralph Norman, they voted no on the rule in the committee. So it only passed with Republican votes, 7 Republicans versus 6 no votes, 2 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And then you have to pass the rule on the floor of the House. And Republicans found that 29 Republicans voted against that. So on the strength of Republican votes, that rule would have failed. And Democrats loved this. They loved the fact that McCarthy was going to have to depend on them. They all waited until it was clear that the Republicans were falling short. And then I think 50 some of them came and voted in favor of the rule. It was a deal that their president had worked out with McCarthy, after all. They don't really have any interest in seeing this go down in flames. So there was plenty of support to get it over the line in the end. And then in the final vote on the substance of the bill, even more bipartisan support, right? Two out of 3 Republicans and even more than that of Democrats in the House voting for this deal. So the lesson I take away here is that, yeah, to do governing, McCarthy cannot just rely on his Republican votes. They just won't stick together in support of compromises with the Democrats, and you can't govern on Republican party line today since there's a Democratic-controlled Senate and a Democrat in the White House. So pretty much by necessity, that means McCarthy needs to be looking for bipartisan coalitions to govern. And that's actually kind of a heartening development to my mind.
I appreciate the optimism. I think that's a really interesting framework that I have not considered myself, that's sort of a direction this is going, and might end up being a pretty interesting, unique thing about this Congress. I mean, we've alluded to a few times, but I think Nancy Pelosi is widely considered one of the most powerful House Majority Leaders ever. And an element of that power is that she very much pushed forward this centralization of the power in Congress in a way that I personally was not a fan of. And I think a lot of people who follow Congress closely sort of saw the deleterious impacts of it. I don't want to veer too far away from this congressional stuff, but I have to ask, just because it's so relevant and it's in the news, I'm very curious to hear your opinion about the debt ceiling just generally as a concept. We actually had some guests on last week, an economist and a legal scholar, very liberal, coming from a very liberal perspective, that were basically making the case that Congress at this point should pass a bill to get rid of the debt limit. And, one of them actually, despite being kind of, I think, more socially liberal, definitely had some concerns about, the spending in Congress and stuff. I don't know how you couldn't at this point, but I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, at this point, you mentioned the fact that you've studied the debt limit a lot. How do you feel about its function? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Do you think it's something we should even have anymore? Or is it at this point more dangerous than it is, a positive constraint on spending?
Well, you can look up the first article I published on this was in 2013. It's from the Brookings Institution, and it's called "Mr. Boehner, Tear Down This Ceiling." And I think that the debt ceiling is largely futile. I consider myself a very strong fiscal conservative, and I don't like the debt limit because I don't think it works. I think that the kind of negotiations that it produces do not give fiscal conservatives very good leverage, because at the end of the day, we know we have to raise the limit. We are not going to self-inflict default. That would just be so stupid that everyone knows that we're going to veer away from that rather than pursuing that. And so I actually think just the regular annual appropriations process gives fiscal conservatives a lot more leverage, because at the end of the day, they don't mind forcing a government shutdown, actually. That's not the end of the world. It's not like particularly great, but probably the left fears government shutdowns more than the right does, and so they're actually fighting on stronger terrain there. That said, I can understand why Republicans today are not going to just give up on the debt limit for nothing, because they do feel like the budget process is broken. We have this congressional budget process, and it's supposed to be the thing that makes us take stock of the big picture every year, but it doesn't work anymore. The president's budgets are largely ignored, and the Congress often just doesn't even pass a budget, except when it needs to rely on budget reconciliation in the Senate. So the debt limit is the one thing that periodically forces us to take stock of the big picture. And for people who are worried about the trajectory of our debt, they're not going to give up on that for nothing. And so I say we need to try harder to come up with a replacement, to come up with a process that does, in fact, force us to take a look at all of spending, because people forget the appropriations process only encompasses about a third of federal spending these days. 2/3 is on autopilot. It's entitlements, mainly Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And we need to find some way to grapple with the size of this problem. Interest payments on the debt are going to be eating up an increasing portion of our budget every year. That's bad. It's bad whether you believe in smaller government or bigger government or whatever. It just means our other priorities are getting crowded out just to pay for things we already got a long time ago. And so we need some kind of replacement for the debt limit is my position. And I wish people were working harder on putting one in place.
I'm curious, from the sort of strong fiscal conservative stance that you say that you sort of view some of the negotiations from, how did you feel about some of the extractions and the concessions that Republicans scored? I mean, I know sort of in my social media feed and circle and some of the pundits I follow, there seemed to be some excitement about, elements of the bill, like forcing votes on the appropriation bills individually. And obviously, the work requirements thing is a little bit more controversial, certainly on the left. But I'm just interested, like what you thought seeing the deal come through, if you felt like there were some meaningful gains there.
I think there are a lot of meaningful gains, and in the end, I think it's not a bad bill, but it's not really equal to the scale of the problem. Like, I would hate for fiscal conservatives to come away from this being like, oh yeah, we won, because we like barely took a bite out of the deficit at all. And our deficits are just enormous. And really, like, we have a sense that this is the new normal, that somehow we just like aren't going to go back to any kind of serious ambition to balance the budget. Maybe that makes sense. An actual precise balanced budget isn't very important. But we're piling up debt as a portion of our GDP at a rate really not seen in peacetime history in the United States. And to me, it's like a strategic weakness for our country. And yeah, like I said, it just stops us from being able to direct our resources to the things that matter to us in the moment. So I worry about the debt. I mean, I worry about Social Security, right, which is funded on this weird trust fund mechanism and thus due to run out of money in the trust fund in about a decade. We probably won't get around to fixing that before we really have to, if we're being honest. But we really do have to do something. I guess there's a lot of people on the left who think, oh, well, when push comes to shove, we'll just raise some taxes and that'll be that. But that's not politically easy at all. We went through a whole decade in the 2010s where it kind of seemed like paying interest on the debt was kind of free because interest rates were zero. And it seemed like we could just borrow to our heart's content and there was nothing bad about it. We're done with that era. We live in an era of inflation and sizable interest rates, and the debt costs us a lot of money now. So we need to turn that ship that turns very slowly and get people to realize, like, we've got to deal with the reality we have now.
I want to bring this back a little bit to your book. You write in the book, you kind of outline 3 paths that Congress could go down from here. And I have them up here on my screen because I want to make sure I get them right. It's decrepitude, rubber stamp, and revival. And I'm wondering if maybe you could just walk us through these 3 potential futures and, maybe tell us a little bit about what we should look for to get an idea of which one of those paths we're kind of heading down.
Yeah. So the first one, decrepitude, just sort of suggests that the kind of dysfunctions we're used to today get worse. And Congress becomes more and more marginalized because of its inability to do things. And it could get worse. We do still do a lot of things pretty well. We pass a lot of non-controversial bills. We pass spending bills. We pass the National Defense Authorization Act. And our leaders in crises get together in a big hurry and push legislation through, right? The COVID experience ought to have made a big impression on people who thought that Congress was just completely broken and couldn't do anything. It did a lot. So I think things could get worse. And if they do, we have to expect that the other 2 branches will try to rush in and sort of take up the slack that Congress is leaving off. So the executive branch interpreting old laws to do new things will be the dominant dynamic. We're already pretty familiar with it today, but it could be even more so. If sort of everyone comes to understand that Congress isn't going to pass new enactments, then you sort of make do. And I think that's a very unhealthy system. You sort of legalize a lot of problems in weird ways, and you end up operating without sort of a strong current bipartisan backing. It's an ugly way for us to go. Maybe we can keep skating by, but at some point, maybe it will lead to default someday if things get bad enough. So that's the first scenario. I mean, that's the alarmingly most plausible one, maybe, because it doesn't really take a change of direction. The rubber stamp scenario is the second one. It basically says, well, if Congress has become such a big problem, let's reform it to get it out of the way. Let's make sure it doesn't mess things up. And so we're going to take all kinds of steps like getting rid of the filibuster and doing some other things to make it so basically the president gets to push his agenda through Congress. And we try to make sure that Congress doesn't stop that. Congress can kind of become an official peanut gallery where people get to go and yell, but we know that the real business is being handled elsewhere and Congress just gets to say yes at the end. To me, that's a very scary scenario, actually. I think there are really a lot of reformers operating very much in good faith who have some sensible sounding ideas like, oh man, government shutdowns are terrible. Let's do automatic continuing resolutions to make sure we never have any more shutdowns. That sounds sensible, but that's, to me, basically putting Congress out of business. And if Congress gets put out of business, I basically worry that self-government has ended in America. And you're going to have, we already have a pretty bad sense of alienation from our federal government, and it'll get much worse. People will have the sense that it's like an alien elite ruling over them, and that'll have some accuracy to it, and that's an ugly basis for politics once that sentiment becomes widespread and powerful. So I worry about that scenario a great deal, and I want to make clear to people that I don't want that kind of congressional reform. We need congressional reforms that are going to revive Congress. So that's the third scenario, revival. And basically, Congress needs to be an interesting place. It should be an exciting place. When you mix up all these diverse elements and put them together, if Congress is working well, you shouldn't know exactly what's going to pop out at the other end. And it should not be just a boring place where two sides butt heads with each other, and that's that. We need to get Congress to be the place where we work out our hardest problems. So immigration is something that I take up at some length in the book. It's I think, the quintessential example. It seems like we should be able to pass an immigration reform bill that rolls together a bunch of different kinds of priorities and gets 300 votes in the House of Representatives. We can't get 435, that's for sure. But I think we ought to be able to find something that both the center against both sides, the center can win. And the way our Congress has been set up has been to frustrate that sense and to make that impossible. We need people to rebel against the current way of things, to say, gosh, this is terrible that our Congress doesn't work out the immigration problem, that we end up fighting out everything under this weird COVID provision that you've done a really good job of covering on Tangle, right? It's crazy how much of our immigration policy we're trying to jam into this executive branch provision that doesn't make any sense as an ongoing way of making policy. But we've kind of all lowered our expectations for Congress so much that seems like the only choice we have. It's not. We ought to be pushing immigration reform hard in Congress. And that will mean frustrating the activists. The activists cannot get everything they want and push through a deal that people will actually want to vote through. But that's okay. Congress should be the engine of compromise. And there's nothing that makes that impossible even today.
I'm curious, before I let you go, I mean, one of the things that kind of interests me about the work that you're doing is that there's so many things in the political world that someone like you could spend a book writing about or could, invest so much time researching in. I'm just curious why you chose this topic. What about the sort of brokenness of Congress sort of drew you in, and why did you decide to pursue a book on this particular issue?
Yeah, so I think I should say that I'm not like a career Congress scholar. There are a lot of really good people who fit that description. It's an institution with a really rich history, and kind of there's enough members that you can sort of run a lot of interesting math to analyze it's the goings on there. And I'm not really a person who's made my whole career. I think of myself as sort of a student of the American policymaking system and how this system of separation of powers actually works in practice. And I came to focus on Congress because of a sense that it's kind of like the wobbly leg of our stool, that we have some serious legitimacy problems in our country. And my feeling is a lot of them stem from the fact that we don't trust our Congress. We don't see our Congress working through difficult problems. And we come to sort of, feel, it's not just America. There's sort of, in Europe, there's a lot of discussion of the democratic deficit, right? Where people feel alienated from what their government is doing. But I think it's a growing problem for us here. And I think making Congress work better is really the only solution I see. So I'm pouring my heart into Congress because I think, it's basically out of a sort of patriotic sense that that's what our country needs. And I hope the book can do some good in that regard.
All right, Philip Wallach, the book is Why Congress. If people want to buy the book and also just keep up with your work more broadly, where's the best place for them to do that?
Sure, I'm a reluctant but somewhat consistent tweeter. So that's at Philip Wallach, 1 L in Philip, 2 L's in Wallach. You can look me up at the American Enterprise Institute, or if you want to look at the book's webpage, it's whycongressbook.com.
Awesome. Philip Wallach, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate you coming back for round 2 after our little technological mishap on the first one. And I hope we get to do it a third time sometime soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, Isaac.